The morning sun climbed higher over the Huon Gulf waters. March 3, 1943, brought crystal-clear skies. At exactly 10 a.m., Japanese naval officers pressed binoculars against their eyes. They peered from the destroyer Yukikaze's bridge. What they saw defied every tactical manual they'd ever studied. 12 twin-engine aircraft raced toward their convoy. These bombers flew impossibly low. Their altitude seemed suicidal. Propeller wash actually disturbed the ocean surface below them. White trails streamed behind each aircraft like signatures written on water. The Japanese officers counted again through their lenses. The numbers couldn't be wrong. American bombers were attacking at mast height. No air force in the world used such tactics. Conventional wisdom called it military suicide. These officers had seconds to comprehend what was happening. In the next quarter hour, they would watch their navy die. The entire Japanese naval presence in the Southwest Pacific was about to vanish. 8 transport vessels packed with 6,900 desperately needed soldiers would become floating coffins. 4 destroyer escorts would shatter like toys. These warships had survived every major Pacific battle since Pearl Harbor. Now they faced complete annihilation. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about aerial warfare was about to sink beneath the Bismarck sea waves. Those waves would swallow 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors. Their bodies would join the wreckage settling into the deep water. The Japanese Naval Command had no idea what was racing toward them. These weren't standard bombers following predictable attack patterns. They were B-25 Mitchell aircraft transformed into flying weapons platforms. A maverick American engineer named Paul "Poppy" Gunn had redesigned these machines. Each bomber now carried 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The firepower concentrated in their noses was devastating. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was about to prove American innovation could create impossible weapons. These bombers wouldn't drop their explosives from safe altitudes above. They would skip their bombs across water surfaces like children skipping stones. Simultaneously, streams of armor-piercing bullets would rake their targets. The Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul in darkness. Midnight on March 1, 1943, marked their departure time. This represented Japan's final major attempt to reinforce Leh by sea transport. General Hitoshi Imamura's 8th Area Army desperately required these reinforcements. New Guinea had become the crucial barrier protecting Japan's southern territories. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the escort formation. 8 of Imperial Japan's most battle-tested destroyers formed the protective screen. The Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo surrounded the transport vessels like shepherds guarding their flock. These destroyers had sailed through countless Pacific storms. Their crews had faced American submarines and aircraft before. Their captains possessed years of combat experience. Yet none of this preparation would matter in the coming hours. 8 transport ships carried the precious human cargo. The Kyokusei Maru, Kenbu Maru, Iomaru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Taiyo Maru, and the Naval Auxiliary Nojima held Japan's hopes for New Guinea. The 51st Division filled their holds. These 6,900 elite troops represented months of training and preparation. Supplies and ammunition packed every available space. Food stores that could sustain Leh garrison for months crowded the cargo areas. Medical supplies, weapons, fuel drums, spare parts, and communications equipment filled the remaining compartments. This convoy carried everything needed to continue the fight. Japanese meteorologists had studied weather patterns for weeks. They predicted 3 days of perfect storm cover. Heavy clouds and rain squalls would hide the convoy from American reconnaissance aircraft. Nature seemed to favor Japanese planning. 100 Zero fighters stood ready at bases across New Britain and New Guinea. These aircraft would provide continuous air cover throughout the journey. The route hugged New Britain's northern coastline. This path minimized exposure time in open waters where American aircraft operated. Captain Tamichi Hara commanded the destroyer Yukikaze. His post-war memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, revealed growing concerns about American tactical changes. Bombers had begun attacking at lower altitudes recently. Strange modifications appeared on captured American aircraft. These observations troubled experienced Japanese naval officers. However, superior commanders generally dismissed such warnings. They believed American desperation was driving these apparent tactical mistakes. Desperate enemies made foolish choices. Unknown to Japanese planners, a revolution was transforming American aerial warfare. The workshops of Port Moresby and Townsville buzzed with constant activity. Since August 1942, Major Paul "Poppy" Gunn had been creating something unprecedented. This former Navy pilot, turned Army Air Forces officer, possessed an innovative mind. Gunn's modifications emerged from brutal necessity. Traditional high-altitude bombing achieved pathetic hit rates against moving ships. Statistics showed less than 1% accuracy from 20,000 feet. Even skilled bombardiers struggled with moving targets below. Ships could observe bombs falling from great heights. Their captains had minutes to execute evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire proved devastatingly effective at medium altitudes. American bombing tactics needed radical transformation. Working with salvaged parts from crashed fighter aircraft, Gunn began his modifications. He installed 450 caliber machine guns in B-25 noses. The bombardier's glazed compartment disappeared. Solid metal replaced transparent sections. 4 additional guns found homes in packages mounted below cockpits. 8 forward-firing weapons now aimed ahead. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. Armor-piercing ammunition traveled at 2910 feet per second. Combined firepower delivered 6,800 bullets per minute in concentrated streams. Major Ed Larner's 90th Bomb Squadron belonged to the 3rd Bomb Group. These crews had spent weeks perfecting skip bombing techniques. Flying at 200 feet or lower, they practiced releasing 500-pound bombs with specially calibrated delay fuses. The bombs would skip across water surfaces before slamming into ship hulls. Fuses were timed for 4 to 5 seconds delay. This timing allowed bombers to clear explosion zones safely. The technique demanded incredible precision and courage. Crews practiced endlessly on the wrecked SS Pruth in Port Moresby Harbor. This target ship absorbed dozens of practice bombs daily. Training continued until crews could achieve consistent hits. Optimal parameters emerged through trial and error. Altitude had to be maintained between 200 and 250 feet. Speed required 200 to 250 miles per hour. Bomb release occurred 60 to 100 feet from targets. These measurements represented the difference between success and suicide. The convoy's protective storm cover began breaking apart earlier than predicted. Nature betrayed Japanese planning. At 10 a.m. on March 2nd, clear skies appeared through cloud gaps. A B-24 Liberator on routine reconnaissance spotted the ships below. Radio messages crackled across Allied communication networks. Within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group roared off Port Moresby runways. Engines strained as heavily loaded bombers climbed toward their targets. The B-17s attacked from 7,000 feet. This altitude was lower than their usual bombing height. However, it remained above effective anti-aircraft range. They bracketed the convoy with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. Explosions erupted around Japanese ships. At 2:45 p.m., The transport Kyokusei Maru absorbed direct hits on her forward cargo holds. Fire spread rapidly to ammunition storage areas. Secondary explosions rocked the ship. Her captain ordered immediate abandonment. 900 soldiers evacuated to the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagamo. These two destroyers now carried dangerous overloads of human cargo. They raced ahead to Leh at maximum speed. Their mission was depositing soldiers safely before rejoining the main convoy. This emergency run would save these men's lives. However, the convoy's escort strength was reduced at the worst possible moment. The departure of two destroyers left fewer guns to defend against the coming attack. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized maintaining escort strength. Circumstances had forced a dangerous compromise. Allied planners had deliberately used high-altitude bombing first. This initial attack tested Japanese defensive capabilities. It also forced the convoy to break its tight formation. Scattered ships would be easier targets for what was coming next. The B-17 attack served as reconnaissance by fire. American commanders learned valuable intelligence about Japanese anti-aircraft strength and response patterns. This information would prove crucial in the following day's assault. March 3rd dawned with crystal clarity over the Huon Gulf. The weather was disastrously perfect for spotting aircraft. Storm clouds had completely dissipated during the night. The convoy had rounded the Huon Peninsula in darkness. They now found themselves exposed in open waters. Safety at Leh lay only 80 miles ahead. The destination seemed tantalizingly close. Japanese officers checked their watches repeatedly. A few more hours would bring them to safety. Anti-aircraft gunners scanned empty skies nervously. At 7:55 a.m., sharp-eyed lookouts spotted the first wave approaching from the south. These aircraft weren't flying at 7,000 feet like yesterday's B-17s. They skimmed the wavetops like giant seabirds. Spray from their propellers was clearly visible. As the aircraft closed to 2,000 yards, their noses erupted in brilliant streams of tracer fire. 8 lines of bullets from each B-25 converged on Japanese ships. Anti-aircraft positions became primary targets. The concentrated firepower was overwhelming. Japanese gunners attempting to man their weapons were cut down instantly. Those who dove for cover couldn't defend their ships. The suppressing fire was devastatingly effective. Behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters. Number 30 Squadron added their own firepower to the assault. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannons and 6 303 machine guns. The combined American and Australian attack overwhelmed Japanese defenses across the entire convoy. Precisely at 10 a.m., Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s of the 90th Bomb Squadron into their attack run. They flew in flights of 3 aircraft each. Their altitude held steady at 200 feet. Speed maintained 250 miles per hour. Months of training had prepared crews for this exact moment. The lead bomber approached the transport Shinai Maru at attack speed. At 300 yards distance, the bomb bay doors opened. A 500-pound bomb dropped toward the water surface. The bomb struck water and skipped twice across the surface. It slammed into the ship's hull just above the waterline. The delay fuse functioned perfectly. 4.5 seconds after release, the bomb detonated inside the cargo hold. The explosion ripped the Shinai Maru apart from within. Her hull plates buckled and separated. Water rushed into the massive breach. The transport began settling immediately. The Kenbu Maru carried drums of aviation fuel in her holds. A skip bomb struck her amidships section. The explosion ignited volatile fuel supplies instantly. A fireball rose 500 feet into the clear morning air. She disintegrated within seconds. Only burning debris remained on the water surface. Oil fires spread outward in widening circles. The aviation fuel that should have powered Japanese aircraft now fed flames on the sea. The Iomaru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession. 3 different B-25s targeted her bulk. Their skip bombs opened her hull like a tin can. Compartments flooded faster than pumps could handle. The Oigawa Maru attempted desperate evasive maneuvers. Her captain ordered hard turns to starboard and port. 2 different B-25s bracketed her path. Skip bombs struck from both directions. Her back broke under the explosions. The ship jackknifed in the middle. Both halves sank within minutes. Hundreds of soldiers disappeared beneath the waves. The destroyer Asashio raced to position herself between attackers and remaining transports. Captain Yasuo Sato commanded from her bridge. His ship represented the convoy's last hope for organized defense. 3 B-25s immediately bracketed the destroyer. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms. Boilers exploded in clouds of superheated steam. Thousands of machine gun bullets swept her decks clean of life. Dead in the water and burning fiercely, she became a stationary target. Following attack waves found her helpless. More bombs and bullets sealed her fate. By 10:15 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after Major Larner's first bomb release, 7 of 8 transports were sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers lay mortally wounded. The Shirayuki would join them shortly. The convoy had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Smoke columns rose from burning wrecks across miles of ocean. The destruction was complete and devastating. However, ship destruction was only the beginning of human tragedy. Thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves thrown into oil-covered waters. Many couldn't swim. Others faced terrible choices in the shark-infested Gulf. Those who could swim had to choose between attempting to reach the New Guinea coast through dangerous currents or clinging to debris hoping for rescue. The coastline lay miles away through treacherous waters. The destroyer Shikinami remained one of the few escorts still operational. Captain Masamichi Ueno ordered immediate rescue operations. His crew worked frantically pulling survivors from the oil-slicked water. They saved approximately 300 men in the first hour. Rope ladders dropped over the sides. Sailors hauled exhausted soldiers aboard. Then American aircraft returned for follow-up attacks. The attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts. Machine gun bullets churned the sea into white foam. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated fire. Survivors scattered across the water had nowhere to hide. PT boats also participated in preventing Japanese survivors from reaching shore. They followed orders to ensure enemy soldiers didn't reinforce Lay's garrison. The mathematical logic of war demanded preventing any reinforcement. For Japanese military observers who survived, the attack revealed devastating truths. American innovation had created weapons beyond their imagination. Skip bombing technique had been developed and perfected in mere months. Japanese doctrine contained no counter-tactics for such attacks. Ships couldn't depress anti-aircraft guns enough to hit aircraft flying at mast height. Torpedoes couldn't target aircraft. Traditional defensive measures proved completely useless. The B-25's firepower shocked surviving Japanese officers. Their fighters typically carried 2 7.7mm machine guns. Occasionally, 20mm cannons supplemented these weapons. The American bombers carried 8 50-caliber machine guns. This represented the firepower of multiple fighters concentrated in single aircraft. All guns aimed forward. All weapons fired simultaneously under pilot control. The devastating effect exceeded anything in Japanese experience. Even more disturbing was the coordination displayed throughout the battle. The attack involved American B-17s, B-25s, A-20s from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Bow fighters. Over 100 aircraft from different units participated. Different services and even different nations worked in perfect synchronization. Radio communication continued throughout the battle. Tactics adjusted in real time based on pilot reports. This level of coordination seemed impossible to Japanese observers. As night fell on March 3rd, surviving Japanese destroyers returned to search for survivors. They found a sea covered with debris and corpses. Oil fires continued burning on the water surface. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Rabaul, carrying fuel supplies. This allowed rescue operations to continue through the dark hours. Searchlights swept across the water, seeking signs of life. In total, 2,700 men were pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200 survivors, including those who had been landed before the main attack, eventually reached Leh safely. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. They never fired a shot at the enemy. All ammunition, food, medicine, and equipment needed for months of operations had gone down with the transports. The aviation fuel in the Kenbu Maru, that should have kept Japanese aircraft flying, now created oil slicks on the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the battle report in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi. The ship lay anchored at Truk Lagoon. According to staff officers present, he sat in complete silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, the implications were crystal clear. Japan could no longer reinforce forward garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied aircraft. The lifeline to advanced bases had been severed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented far more than a tactical defeat. It marked a fundamental shift in Pacific warfare patterns. Never again would Japanese forces attempt major reinforcement by surface convoy within Allied aircraft range. Strategic implications rippled through Japanese military planning. General Imamura flew personally to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. His mission was delivering the complete battle report to the highest levels. In a meeting lasting 6 hours, he presented evidence that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to counter effectively. The Americans weren't simply building more aircraft. They were revolutionizing how aircraft fought wars. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement prioritized Southwest area operations. New Guinea operations gained priority over Solomon Islands campaigns. However, without ability to reinforce by sea, this remained an empty gesture. Japanese forces in New Guinea would fight without hope of significant reinforcement or resupply. They were strategically abandoned to face American industrial might with dwindling resources. For American forces, victory validated 2 years of constant innovation and tactical adaptation. General George Kenney had transformed his 5th Air Force from traditional bombing units into something unprecedented. An aerial navy capable of controlling seas without surface ships. Major Ed Larner received the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the skip bombing attack. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the mission that destroyed the entire convoy. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later on April 30, 1943. His B-25 crashed during landing at Dobodura Airfield. He had survived 87 combat missions, only to die in a peacetime accident. North American aviation immediately incorporated guns' field modifications into factory production lines. By late 1943, B-25Gs rolled off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower. Some models even carried 75mm cannons, though these proved less practical than machine guns. The B-25H model carried 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns total. These became among the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. Beyond strategic implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy. The 2890 Japanese who died weren't mere statistics in war reports. They were sons, fathers, husbands with families waiting at home. Many were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students before military service. They barely understood the war they were drafted to fight. Their deaths created thousands of grieving families across Japan. American pilots who strafed survivors also carried psychological burdens afterward. Years later, many struggled with memories of what they had done. Military necessity of preventing enemy reinforcement didn't ease the emotional weight. Some aircrew reported nightmares about strafing missions for years afterward. The human cost of victory extended to both sides of the conflict. Success at Bismarck Sea triggered acceleration of American tactical innovation programs. Within months, new techniques emerged from Pacific workshops. Parafrags, parachute fragmentation bombs, enabled low-level attacks on airfields without bomber damage from their own explosions. White phosphorus bombs improved target marking capabilities. Skip bombing fuses gained more reliable delay mechanisms. Each innovation built upon America's unlimited industrial capacity. Americans could afford experimental failures because they cost only replaceable material. Material resources were essentially unlimited. Japanese innovation stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources. Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual rather than material solutions. The kamikaze concept emerged partly from recognizing they couldn't match American technology. If they couldn't outbuild or out-innovate Americans, they would try to out-die them. Crucial to victory was American code-breaking capability. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and Naval Intelligence in Washington had decrypted Japanese messages revealing the convoy's complete schedule, route, and composition. General Kenny knew exactly when and where to strike. This allowed positioning forces for maximum effect. However, this intelligence advantage required careful protection. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy naturally. This maintained the fiction that visual observation rather than signals intelligence provided warning. The deception proved completely successful. Japanese forces never realized their codes were compromised. They continued using the same communication systems throughout the war. This intelligence advantage proved invaluable in subsequent operations. Royal Australian Air Force participation demonstrated superior Allied coordination capabilities. RAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft seamlessly. They communicated on identical radio frequencies. They followed the same tactical procedures. Squadron leader William Bill Newton of No. 22 Squadron RAF flew 3 sorties during the battle. He later received the Victoria Cross posthumously for actions in subsequent operations before being captured and executed by Japanese forces. Allied integration contrasted sharply with Japanese operations. Japanese Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively. They often competed for resources rather than cooperating against common enemies. This fundamental weakness handicapped Japanese military effectiveness. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredible supply chain stretching across America. Each B-25 required 16 5,000 individual parts, manufactured in dozens of states. The .50 caliber ammunition fired came from plants spanning Connecticut to California. Billions of rounds were manufactured during the war years. Skip bombing required special delayed action fuses manufactured by millions in American munitions plants. Training fuel came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship from United States factories. This supply chain operated while America simultaneously fought in Europe. The same industrial base supplied Britain and the Soviet Union while maintaining forces across the Pacific. The Japanese convoy, destroyed at Bismarck Sea, represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. The forces that destroyed it represented a tiny fraction of American production capability. American pilots who devastated the convoy averaged 400 flight hours before entering combat. They practiced skip bombing for weeks, using virtually unlimited fuel and ammunition. Each pilot dropped dozens of practice bombs before the actual mission. Japanese pilots in 1943 increasingly entered combat with less than 100 hours flight time. Fuel shortages severely limited training opportunities. Veteran pilots who might have taught newcomers were dead, killed by the relentless mathematics of American industrial production. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students thrown into combat against experienced American aviators. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea faced strategic isolation. Supplies had to arrive by submarine, dangerous and severely limited in capacity. Fast destroyer runs at night offered another option, equally hazardous and insufficient for major operations. These Tokyo Express runs could deliver only fractions of what the destroyed convoy had carried. Japanese forces turned to small barges, attempting to creep along coastlines at night with minimal supplies. The sleek PT boats carved through dark waters like hunting sharks. Modified B-25s swept overhead with radar eyes piercing the night. These machines had one mission: find Japanese supply runs, destroy them completely. By June 1943, this deadly combination had worked perfectly. Japanese troops in New Guinea were down to half their normal food. By September, their situation had become desperate beyond imagination. Soldiers who once conquered entire nations now scraped bark from trees. They dug roots from jungle soil with their bare hands. They chewed grass like cattle. The mighty army that had crushed Singapore was literally starving to death. Bullets hadn't defeated them. Interdiction had. Air power had cut their lifelines completely. Japanese military thinking couldn't process this reality. For centuries, samurai culture had shaped their warrior traditions. Personal combat meant everything. Individual heroism defined honor. Face-to-face battle proved worth. But the industrialized killing at Bismarck Sea made no sense to them. Where was the honor in dying to machines you couldn't even see? What Bushido existed in being machine-gunned while floating helplessly in ocean water? This cultural disconnect would poison the rest of the Pacific War. Japanese forces would turn increasingly to suicide tactics. Banzai charges became common. Kamikaze attacks multiplied. They desperately sought meaningful death against mechanized slaughter. Americans answered with bigger guns, more technology, better machines, industrial solutions to every problem. The gap between ancient warrior codes and modern industrial warfare grew wider every day. Papigun had installed automatic cameras in the tail sections of his modified B-25s. These cameras triggered automatically when bomb bay doors opened. The cameras captured the convoy's destruction in devastating clarity. Ships exploding in towering columns of flame, vessels capsizing with agonizing slowness, burning oil spreading across dark water. The photographs provided documentation unlike anything seen before in warfare. These images served three critical purposes simultaneously. Intelligence officers used them for accurate battle damage assessment. No more guessing about destroyed targets. Pilot claims could be verified against photographic evidence. The pictures became invaluable training materials. Future pilots could see exactly how skip bombing worked under real combat conditions. They served as powerful propaganda weapons. American strength was demonstrated to allies and enemies alike. The Japanese possessed no equivalent photographic technology. They relied entirely on pilot reports. These reports were often wildly inaccurate during the chaos of aerial combat. The B-25s that annihilated the convoy had been flying continuously for months. New Guinea's climate was brutal on machinery. Tropical heat baked engine compartments. Humidity bred corrosion in electrical systems. Coral dust abraded cylinders and pistons. Yet mechanical failures during the crucial mission were almost non-existent. American engines were built with massive power reserves. They functioned even when maintenance was imperfect. Japanese aircraft suffered increasingly from poor upkeep as the war dragged on. Spare parts became scarce. Qualified mechanics grew even rarer. Engines that looked superior on paper failed regularly because proper maintenance was impossible. The Navy's prized Zero fighters sat grounded for lack of replacement parts. Meanwhile, American aircraft flew multiple missions daily without missing a beat. During the battle, American and Australian aircraft chattered constantly over radio frequencies. Pilots reported enemy positions with precision. They warned teammates about incoming fighter attacks. They coordinated approaches for maximum effect. This real-time information sharing multiplied their combat effectiveness exponentially. Aircraft could support each other instantly. Opportunities could be exploited as they appeared. Japanese communications were minimal and frequently useless. Radio equipment failed regularly. Different services used incompatible frequencies. Radio discipline was practically non-existent. Ships and aircraft fought in complete isolation. They couldn't coordinate attacks effectively. They couldn't warn each other about approaching threats. American pilots flew into every battle knowing rescue was probable. If they were shot down and survived the crash, they had excellent survival odds. Blood plasma was standard in every medical kit. Morphine killed pain instantly. Sulfa drugs prevented infection. Penicillin would soon save countless lives. Medical evacuation by aircraft was routine procedure. Wounded pilots often reached hospitals within hours of being shot down. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short, even before the convoy disaster. The medicines that might have saved lives now lay scattered across the ocean floor. This knowledge ate at morale like acid. American pilots flew with unshakable confidence. Japanese forces fought with the desperation of doomed men. The Battle of Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it simply couldn't afford to lose. Those 8 destroyed transports represented months of production from shipyards already stretched beyond their limits. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant chunks of Japanese industrial output that couldn't be replaced quickly. For America, the battle was economically meaningless. The ammunition expended was replaced within days from enormous stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from assembly lines. American factories were churning out 100,000 aircraft every year by 1943. That meant nearly 300 new planes rolled off production lines daily. The fuel burned in training and combat represented barely a rounding error in American petroleum production. The Battle of Bismarck Sea sent shockwaves through the remainder of the Pacific War. It proved beyond any doubt that air power could control shipping lanes without any naval vessels whatsoever. It demonstrated that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces, it marked the beginning of their end in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off completely from reinforcement and supply, they would fight a series of increasingly desperate holding actions. Each engagement would end in complete annihilation or slow starvation. The island-hopping strategy became perfectly viable because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed entirely. They could be left to wither like fruit on dead vines without any supplies reaching them. The stunning success at Bismarck Sea accelerated B-25 development dramatically. The B-25G model entering service in late 1943 carried a massive 75mm cannon. This was the largest weapon ever successfully mounted on any twin-engine bomber. Though the cannon proved less practical than multiple machine guns, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment constantly. Each new iteration reflected lessons learned from actual combat. Industrial capability allowed changes to be implemented with stunning speed. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence to its core. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet emphasized American material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. This represented a significant shift from earlier assessments. Those reports had attributed American successes to pure luck or Japanese tactical mistakes. One captured report stated bluntly that enemy production capacity allowed them to implement new tactics faster than effective counters could possibly be developed. This recognition of overwhelming industrial disadvantage marked a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. After Bismarck, Sea Imperial General Headquarters conducted an exhaustive review of Japanese strategy throughout the Southwest Pacific region. The conclusions reached were sobering beyond belief. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer remotely possible. American air power had achieved complete operational supremacy over vast areas. The industrial gap was widening rapidly rather than narrowing. Traditional naval superiority was completely irrelevant if ships couldn't survive concentrated air attacks. The recommendation was to abandon all offensive operations immediately. Resources should be concentrated on preparing defenses of the inner perimeter. But even this defensive strategy assumed American attacks would come at a manageable pace. This assumption would prove tragically and completely optimistic. The skip bombing technique pioneered at Bismarck Sea spread like wildfire throughout American forces. Navy PBY Catalinas adopted it for devastating night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots used it extensively during the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots received training in the technique in case they encountered enemy vessels. This rapid proliferation was possible because America had completely standardized training procedures. Equipment was identical across units. Communications worked seamlessly between services. A technique developed in New Guinea could be implemented in the Aleutians within mere weeks. Japanese forces remained divided by bitter service rivalries and poor communication systems. They rarely shared innovations, even within the same theater of operations. The numbers tell the complete story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory inevitable. During World War II, American factories produced exactly 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Ammunition plants manufactured 12 billion rounds of 50-caliber machine gun ammunition. Flight schools graduated an astounding 193,440 fully trained pilots. Every single B-25 component was stockpiled in multiple secure locations across the Pacific Theater. Against this industrial tsunami, Japanese military courage was completely irrelevant. The bravest samurai warrior couldn't overcome the relentless mathematics of American mass production. Papigun's camera installations provided unprecedented documentation of actual combat effectiveness. The footage was studied frame by frame to reveal optimal tactics. Bomb release should occur at 200 to 250 feet altitude. Approach speed should be maintained at exactly 245 miles per hour. Release distance should be 60 to 100 feet from target for maximum destructive effect. This scientific approach to warfare was quintessentially American. Everything could be measured, everything could be analyzed, everything could be optimized. War became an engineering problem requiring industrial solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit and individual courage. The loss of supplies at Bismarck Sea created an immediate economic crisis for Japanese forces throughout New Guinea. Within weeks, frontline units reported critical shortages affecting every aspect of operations. Ammunition was restricted to exactly 10 rounds per day per soldier. Rice rations were reduced to a starvation level of 400 grams daily. Medical supplies were completely exhausted across all units. Fuel for vehicles became completely unavailable. Aircraft were grounded indefinitely for lack of replacement parts. American forces, by contrast, complained loudly if ice cream wasn't available for daily consumption. The economic disparity was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often refused to believe American supply levels were real. They assumed they were being shown elaborate propaganda displays. Success at Bismarck Sea dramatically accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare techniques. Within months, new developments emerged from research facilities. Improved skip bombing fuses featured more reliable time delays. Napalm was developed for devastating area attacks on Japanese positions. Rocket-assisted bombs provided increased penetration of hardened targets. White phosphorus markers allowed precise target identification from great distances. Each innovation built directly on America's industrial capacity to experiment freely and implement changes with lightning speed. Americans could afford failed experiments because they only cost replaceable material. Japanese innovations stagnated completely because every experiment consumed absolutely irreplaceable resources. Behind every B-25 that attacked at Bismarck Sea stood a maintenance crew that kept it flying under impossible conditions. These men worked miracles daily in primitive jungle workshops. They overhauled complex engines using improvised tools. They repaired battle damage with whatever materials they could scavenge. They implemented field modifications using only hand tools and determination. Aircraft were turned around between missions in mere hours, despite severe battle damage. This maintenance capability reflected America's vast pool of industrial training. Hundreds of thousands of Americans already knew how to fix engines professionally. They could repair complex electrical systems. They could work metal with precision. This enormous pool of technical expertise was perhaps America's single greatest military advantage over any enemy. The controversial strafing of survivors served a harsh but calculated military purpose. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific learned that attempting to reach shore after their ships were sunk meant almost certain death. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate battle itself. It affected Japanese morale negatively in every future engagement. General Douglas MacArthur called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. His official communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses, but the strategic impact fully justified his obvious enthusiasm. Air power had proven conclusively that it could interdict sea lanes as effectively as submarines or traditional surface vessels. Admiral Yamamoto read the detailed battle reports with growing despair. He made a fateful decision that would cost him his life. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been completely shattered by the devastating defeat. This decision, driven by depression following Bismarck Sea, would lead directly to his death on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers learned of his planned itinerary through intercepted communications. P-38 Lightnings intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot him down. American forces institutionalized all lessons from Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within weeks, training manuals were completely updated with detailed skip bombing techniques. New pilots practiced low-level attacks until they achieved proficiency. Tactical doctrine was thoroughly revised to emphasize anti-shipping operations as a primary mission. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center analyzed every single aspect of the battle in minute detail. They produced comprehensive reports that were distributed immediately throughout the Pacific Theater. Japanese institutional learning was severely hampered by deep systemic problems. Bitter service rivalries prevented completely honest analysis of failures. The Army and Navy blamed each other constantly, rather than examining fundamental weaknesses objectively. Face-saving concerns consistently obscured important lessons from failures. By the time Japanese forces developed even partial counters to skip bombing, American tacticians had already moved on to entirely new approaches. The B-25 modifications that proved so devastatingly successful went into immediate mass production. North American aviation factories in Kansas City and Inglewood completely retooled their production lines within weeks of receiving specifications. By late 1943, new B-25s rolled off assembly lines with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment. They featured reinforced nose structures specifically designed for gun installations. They had upgraded engines optimized for low-level performance characteristics. They included improved armor protection for aircrew members. They came with built-in camera installations for automatic battle documentation. This lightning-fast transition from experimental field modification to standardized mass production exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan could never hope to match. After Bismarck, American bomber crew training incorporated low-level attack techniques as completely standard curriculum. Pilots practiced skip bombing extensively at training bases throughout Texas and Arizona. They used specially constructed target ships floating in the Gulf of Mexico and California's Salton Sea. This training consumed enormous quantities of aviation fuel. Each pilot burned through thousands of gallons learning these techniques properly. But America could easily afford such expenditures. By 1943, American refineries were producing an astounding 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually. Japan, meanwhile, struggled desperately to import enough fuel to keep its remaining fleet operational. Several B-25s returned from Bismarck Sea carrying significant battle damage that would have doomed lesser aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire had punched multiple holes through wings and fuselage. Control surfaces were badly damaged. Engines had been shot up severely. Within exactly 72 hours, every single damaged aircraft was flying combat missions again. Repairs were accomplished using aluminum patches fabricated quickly in primitive field workshops. Engines were completely replaced using improvised hoists and pulleys. Control cables were carefully spliced using materials salvaged from destroyed Japanese equipment. Fuel tanks were expertly patched using rubber strips cut from captured Japanese materials. Japanese aircraft suffering similar damage would have been immediately written off as total losses. If anything remained salvageable, it would have been cannibalized for desperately needed spare parts. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing devastatingly effective were absolute marvels of precision American engineering. They were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. They had to survive the tremendous impact of hitting water at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. They had to function reliably after bouncing multiple times across wave surfaces. They had to detonate at precisely the correct moment for maximum effect. American factories produced these complex fuses literally by the millions. Each individual fuse was thoroughly tested and officially certified before shipment. Japanese fuses, by comparison, suffered failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943. This was due to serious quality control problems and increasingly severe material shortages. American aircraft found the Japanese convoy at precisely the expected time and location, despite challenging weather conditions and enormous distances involved. This reflected clear superiority in multiple critical areas. Navigation training was extensive. American pilots averaged 400 hours of flight time before entering combat. Navigation equipment was accurate and reliable. Compasses and instruments functioned perfectly. Map quality was exceptional due to detailed charts created from comprehensive pre-war surveys. Weather forecasting was remarkably accurate. Meteorological support had predicted the clearing weather with perfect precision. Japanese navigation increasingly relied on simply following lead aircraft or identifying coastal landmarks. This severely limited their operational flexibility. American intelligence had learned about the convoy through successful code-breaking operations, but this invaluable secret had to be carefully protected. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy through visual observation. This maintained the crucial fiction that visual sighting rather than signals intelligence had provided the warning. The deception proved so successful that Japanese forces never realized their most secret codes had been completely compromised. They continued using the same encryption systems that American cryptographers read as easily as newspaper headlines. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who managed to reach Leh found a garrison already surviving on drastically reduced rations. The supplies that were supposed to sustain operations for many months had been completely destroyed. Within weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for any edible materials in the hostile jungle. Disease became completely epidemic throughout their ranks. Malaria struck down hundreds. Dysentery weakened everyone. Tropical ulcers infected minor wounds. Malnutrition made recovery impossible. By June 1943, the effective fighting strength of Japanese forces in Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone. American pilots at Bismarck Sea flew limited combat tours, typically 50 missions or 6 months of combat, before rotating home to train the next generation of pilots. This system preserved hard-won experience. It disseminated crucial lessons throughout the entire force. Combat veterans became flight instructors. They passed on life-saving techniques to new pilots arriving from training schools. Japanese pilots flew combat missions until they died. The expertise gained at terrible cost was lost forever when experienced pilots were killed. By late 1943, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead. Their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices. They faced American veterans who had survived months of combat and learned from the best teachers available. The Battle of Bismarck Sea represented a perfect convergence of American technological advantages that Japan simply couldn't match. Industrial capacity produced the modified aircraft needed. Innovation culture allowed rapid field modifications to be implemented. Training resources perfected new tactics through intensive practice. Intelligence capability located targets with pinpoint precision. Communication systems coordinated complex attacks flawlessly. Supply chains sustained operations indefinitely without interruption. No single advantage was individually decisive. Their combination proved absolutely overwhelming against any opposition. The Japanese faced not just superior numbers of aircraft and weapons. They confronted superior systems that operated at every level: industrial systems, organizational systems, technological systems, systems they couldn't hope to duplicate or counter effectively. The Battle of Bismarck Sea lasted exactly 3 days total. The decisive action occurred in just 15 minutes on March 3, 1943. In those crucial 15 minutes, the fundamental nature of warfare in the Pacific theater changed forever and completely. Air power proved beyond any possible doubt that it could control vital sea lanes without requiring any naval vessels whatsoever. Industrial innovation demonstrated conclusively that it could create entirely new forms of warfare, faster than any enemy could develop effective counters. American production capacity showed that quantity, when properly applied, possessed a devastating quality all its own. For the Japanese, Bismarck Sea represented far more than just another military defeat. It provided undeniable proof that their entire traditional approach to warfare had become completely obsolete. Courage meant nothing against modified B-25s. Spiritual strength was useless against 8 forward-firing machine guns. Martial tradition couldn't stop skip bombs delivered with scientific precision. The most perfectly trained warrior was completely helpless against enemies who had successfully industrialized warfare itself. The 2890 Japanese who died in the Bismarck Sea were victims not just of American bombs and bullets. They died because of a technological and industrial revolution that had made their form of warfare as obsolete as ancient samurai swords. They had trained their entire lives for honorable war against fellow warriors. Instead, they died in a mechanized conflict against machines and systems they couldn't possibly match or counter. For the Americans, Bismarck Sea validated years of careful preparation and constant innovation. Papigun's field modifications developed with salvaged parts and primitive hand tools had proven more devastatingly effective than any purpose-built weapon system. The marriage of American ingenuity with unlimited industrial capacity had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japan simply couldn't counter. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the Southwest Pacific Campaign. It demonstrated definitively that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity was military capacity. The nation that could build the most would train the most. The nation that could innovate fastest would adapt quickest and ultimately prevail. Traditional military virtues remained important. Courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice still mattered. But they were no longer sufficient for victory. Industrial capacity had become the decisive factor in modern warfare. In exactly 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bombers accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy couldn't prevent. They severed Japan's crucial supply lines completely. They doomed Japanese forces in New Guinea to inevitable starvation and ultimate defeat. Those 15 minutes marked the precise moment when industrial warfare definitively replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who couldn't believe what they were witnessing were absolutely right to be incredulous. They were seeing something that shouldn't have been remotely possible according to everything they had learned about naval warfare. But American industrial innovation had made the impossible seem routine. The unthinkable had become standard operating procedure. The Battle of Bismarck Sea stands as permanent historical proof that in modern warfare, the nation with the best factories will always defeat the nation with the bravest soldiers. It was a lesson written in towering flames across the dark waters of Huon Gulf. It was a lesson that would define every aspect of the remainder of the Pacific War completely. In the age of industrial warfare, production represents power. Innovation becomes strategy. The assembly line proves ultimately mightier than any sword. The Japanese couldn't believe it when B-25 strafers destroyed 8 ships in exactly 15 minutes. By the time they finally accepted this new reality, it was already far too late. The war had been lost not in those 15 minutes of spectacular destruction. It had been lost during the years of intensive industrial preparation that made those 15 minutes possible. The Battle of Bismarck Sea was simply the moment when that long-prepared victory became undeniably visible to everyone who witnessed it.